Welcome to the webcast on developing and implementing an effective harassment prevention policy in the workplace. My name is Anne Clennett. I work in the education and engagement area at the Alberta Human Rights Commission, and I will be your host for this webcast. The information provided today can be used by any organization to develop a harassment prevention policy. The human rights legislation referred to in this webcast is the Alberta Human Rights Act. The commission referenced is the Alberta Human Rights Commission. If you are attending this webcast from outside of Alberta, or if you are from an organization that falls under federal jurisdiction, check with your local, provincial, or federal Human Rights Commission to find out how the provincial or federal act applies to your organization. We would like to advise you that the information presented today is not legal advice. Rather, it is information that your organization can use to develop a harassment prevention policy. Let's get started. Today's presenter is Sushila Samy, who is the Diversity Specialist with the Alberta Human Rights Commission. She will take us through the process of how to develop and implement an effective harassment prevention policy for the workplace. I will now turn it over to her. Welcome, Sushila.
Thank you, Anne. In this presentation, we will discuss the reasons for developing a harassment prevention policy, the components of an effective policy, and the ways to implement it. Organizations tend to start thinking about a harassment prevention policy only after they receive harassment complaints. When there is no policy, employees that are being harassed do not know what they should do when harassed. As a result, they either quit their employment or make a complaint with the Alberta Human Rights Commission. A policy will enable organizations to deal with harassment complaints internally, make it cost and time effective, and maintain a good relationship with their employees. And it helps avoid any negative publicity for your organization. In this presentation, we will use the following definitions. Harassment is a form of discrimination based on the areas and grounds in the Alberta Human Rights Act and can be based on gender, gender identity, and gender expression, which is sexual harassment, racial, due to one's race, color, ancestry, or place of origin, because of one's disability, mental and/or physical. It can be religious beliefs, or due to family status, marital status, age, sexual orientation, or source of income. Harassment occurs when someone is subjected to unwelcome and uninvited verbal, non-verbal, or physical conduct. Harassment tends to interfere with the employee's work performance and creates an intimidating or hostile work environment, not only for the individual being harassed, but also for others in the workplace. Sometimes harassment is not based on the areas and grounds of the Alberta Human Rights Act. In these circumstances, a complaint cannot be made to the Alberta Human Rights Commission, and it can only be dealt with by the organization's harassment prevention policy, a collective agreement in unionized work environments, or by the courts. Now that you know the difference between when harassment is discrimination under the legislation and when it isn't, let's talk about why organizations should have a harassment prevention policy. Take a moment to think about why it's important to have your organization have a harassment prevention policy. There are many reasons why organizations need a policy, and I'm going to give you the 10 most important. The first reason is that policy shows commitment by organizations to deal with harassment. It helps organizations reduce their liability in harassment. Courts have held employers liable for harassment in employment. Developing and implementing a policy could reduce the organization's liability. It identifies the various forms of harassment and provides definitions so that employees, clients, and customers are clear about what constitutes harassment. Policy educates and informs all employees, including management, on their role in preventing harassment. It provides a process for reporting harassment and identifying who's responsible for dealing with a complaint. It also informs managers and supervisors on how to deal with harassment when allegations of harassment are brought to them. A policy allows for the complaint to be dealt with internally. If the complaint is dealt with effectively by the internal process, it would not have to go to an external body such as the Human Rights Commission. A harassment prevention policy outlines consequences for the harassing behavior. Employees will know that there are consequences for harassing others. It assures employees that there will be no retaliation for making a complaint or for assisting with a complaint, and that disciplinary action will be taken against those who retaliate. This would make it easier for employees to bring forward complaints of harassment to the person responsible for handling them. It warns employees against making complaints that are frivolous or vexatious, that is, with no merit whatsoever, and with the sole purpose of harassing another person. When I was a human rights officer, I used to mediate or investigate harassment complaints under the human rights legislation. I used to think how effectively some of the complaints could have been dealt with by the organization if they had developed and implemented a harassment prevention policy. They would not have had a complaint at the Alberta Human Rights Commission, and it would have saved them time and money. And it would have let employees know that they take harassment seriously and that they would take action to stop it. That is why I emphasize the importance of developing and implementing a harassment prevention policy in your organization.
Sushila has provided us with an excellent catalog of 10 important reasons for organizations to have a harassment prevention policy. Now that we've looked at the reasons for having a policy, let's talk about the 3 phases of developing and implementing a harassment prevention policy. The first phase is the pre-policy action. The second phase is developing the components to be included in the policy, and the third phase is implementing the policy. Here's what you need to consider prior to developing your policy. First, ensure that management is ready for the development of a policy and that they are prepared to approve it. It is much easier to develop and implement a policy if management understands the need for it and supports it. If there is reluctance to develop a policy, give them the reasons why it is in the best interest of your organization to have one, as Sushila has just outlined for us. Then you will need to determine to whom the policy applies. For example, would one policy apply to all of the locations where your organization operates, or would each location have its own policy? This is especially important for organizations that have businesses in different locations throughout the province. Next, consult with your stakeholders on the development of the policy. Your stakeholders could include employees, unions in unionized work environments, and others. Include those impacted by the policy, as this will ensure their collaboration in implementing it. Finally, decide who will develop the policy. It could be an individual or a committee comprised of management and non-management employees. It is preferable to have a committee from different areas of the organization, as well as union representatives, if applicable, to develop the policy so that all of the different perspectives are taken into account. Now that you know what you need to do prior to developing a harassment prevention policy, Sushila will outline the second phase, components that should be included in your policy.
There are several sections within a harassment prevention policy. Let us talk about what's important to include in a policy. Develop the purpose of the policy. The purpose outlines the reasons, which could be to create a respectful, inclusive workplace for all employees, or to develop an internal process for dealing with a complaint, or it may be a combination of these. A policy shows management's commitment to preventing harassment in the workplace. A statement in the purpose that the organization has zero tolerance for harassment sends a clear message that the organization takes harassment seriously. It identifies to whom the policy applies. State that it applies to permanent, part-time, and casual employees, contractors, volunteers if you have any, and job applicants, as they are all protected from harassment under the Alberta Human Rights Act. Sometimes, casual employees and contractors assume that the policy does not apply to them and only applies to permanent employees. Following the purpose, there are 3 areas to complete: definitions, roles, and process. Within each of these areas, there are multiple components. Let's start by looking at the definitions that need to be included in the policy. Please note that the details I provide here will be available for you to download in the list provided through the resource icon. The definitions provide a clear understanding of the terms used in the policy, define the areas and grounds in the Alberta Human Rights Act, as well as the different forms of harassment. It is important to clearly define and include harassment on all the 15 grounds of the Act. Use the definitions in the Act, which can also be found on the Commission's information sheet entitled Protected Areas and Grounds under the Alberta Human Rights Act. In addition to the harassment protected under the Act, also include harassment or bullying that is not protected under the Act, which must be dealt with by your policy. This will ensure that you have a process to deal with it if it occurs. Example of harassment or bullying not protected under the Act includes criticizing work or blaming, scolding, demeaning, yelling or screaming at an employee for no apparent reason. Although these are unwelcome offensive behaviors, if they are not related to a ground in the Act, the Alberta Human Rights Commission will not be able to take a complaint. Define other terms in the policy, such as complainant, respondent, workplace, retaliation, and any other terms that you think may cause confusion. In the Roles and Responsibilities section of the policy, specify the roles and responsibilities of your management and non-management employees. Emphasize that your supervisors and managers are responsible for role modeling the behavior and dealing with harassment when they see it, even when no one reports it. State that it's the responsibility of all employees to ensure that they do not harass others and to report when they are harassed or when they observe others being harassed. Assign someone in your organization the responsibility for monitoring and updating the policy. New tribunal and court decisions may have an impact on the policy, so it may have to be reviewed and updated on a regular basis. We have covered the components of a policy that are related to definitions, roles, and responsibilities. A harassment prevention policy should also lay out the process for making and resolving a complaint. Answers to the following questions will help clarify the process for making and resolving complaints. Make sure the process can be easily implemented. The questions the policy should answer are: how should the complaint be reported, in writing, verbally, or both? I suggest that it be in writing, as it is easier to deal with the complaint when all the allegations are in writing and available to the mediator or investigator. What information is required from the employee who is making the complaint? The complaint should include name or names of the alleged harasser or harassers, dates when the harassment took place, where the harassment happened, whether it was at work, at a client site, at a company-sponsored event, or somewhere else, details of the harassing behavior, names of witnesses, any action that the employee may have taken, example, asking the harasser to stop the behavior. Who is responsible in your organization for receiving and dealing with the complaint? Name a few levels of position in your organization, such as the director, the manager of human resources, or direct supervisor, so that your employee can go to the person with whom they are most comfortable. How will the complaint be dealt with? Will it be handled first through mediation or through other informal options? Or will it go directly to an investigation? If it is being mediated or investigated, will it be done internally by your own staff or by an external mediator or investigator that you may contact? How will the complainant and respondent be informed of the result of the investigation? It is preferable to give them the result by email so there is record that they were informed. If the complainant and/or the respondent are not satisfied with the outcome, what is the appeal process? I suggest having 2 or 3 employees on an appeal committee to hear the appeal. Some organizations have decided not to have an internal appeal process, but to give employees the option of making a complaint to the Alberta Human Rights Commission, the union, if applicable, or to the courts. What are the approximate timelines for resolving the complaint? Provide for extending the timeline if the complaint cannot be dealt with within the given time frame. Include that the parties to the complaint will be informed if the timelines need to be extended.
That's great, Sushila. It sounds like if a policy is able to answer all of those questions, the organizations will have a solid process and will be well situated to respond to incidents of harassment should they occur. What are the final components needed in the policy?
The final component for a policy is to make it clear that intent is not necessary for the behavior to be harassment. Rather, it is the impact that it has on the person being harassed. Employees tend to think that it can't be harassment if they did not intend to harass the employee. For example, when telling racial or sexual jokes, employees think that they are just being funny and that they think that since they did not mean to harm anyone by their jokes, it is not harassment. This is not the case. State that disciplinary action will be taken if there is found to be harassment. A statement such as, disciplinary action will be taken up to and including termination of employment, allows you to take a range of actions depending on the severity of the harassment. It also ensures that your employees know that there are consequences for harassing others. Organizations do not have to describe the type of disciplinary action in the policy. Clearly state that there will be no retaliation for making a complaint. This means that your managers, supervisors, and co-workers will not take any negative action against witnesses, the employee making the complaint, or anyone else assisting with the complaint. State that your organization will attempt to maintain confidentiality of the complaint as much as possible. However, you may want to note that this may not always be possible, as the employee against whom the allegations are made would have to be informed of the allegations, as well as the name of the person making the allegations. The complainant and witnesses may have to be identified for interviews during an investigation, and names may also have to be provided to external agencies. For example, names of the employees may have to be provided to law enforcement authorities when there has been assault. Inform employees that you deal with the complaint promptly and in a fair manner following the process outlined in the policy. Include an option for your employees to call the Alberta Human Rights Commission for complaints that fall within the areas and grounds of the Alberta Human Rights Act if they are not satisfied with how their complaint was dealt with. Be sure to inform them that a complaint to the Commission must be made within 12 months of the alleged incident of harassment.
Now that we have talked about the process for making and resolving a complaint, let's move on to what happens after the complaint has been resolved. Once the complaint has been dealt with, you need to include a process for healing. Whether a complaint is dealt with in mediation or investigation, several of your employees may be involved. They could include witnesses or other staff that may know about the complaint. When there is no communication about the complaint, it leaves employees speculating about what happened with the complaint and its outcome. It is a good idea after the complaint has been resolved to bring all of your employees together and provide them with a brief explanation of the complaint and how it was dealt with without breaching the confidentiality of the parties involved. For example, if you dealt with a sexual harassment complaint by investigating and took disciplinary action, you could mention that without naming the parties involved. You could acknowledge that it has been a difficult time for everyone and that you appreciate the assistance of those that came forward as witnesses or who assisted in the investigation of the complaint. This gives employees faith in the process and shows management's commitment to creating a zero-tolerance environment for harassment. Now it is time to consider how to implement a harassment prevention policy.
In my work in the human rights area, I find that some organizations have great policies, but often no one knows about them as they are filed away or sitting in a manager's or director's office. A policy is effective only if it's available to all employees and implemented. Let's look at the ways that your organization could implement the policy that you have taken so much time and effort to develop. You will have access to the details I provide in a document in the resource list. One of the first things is to make sure the policy is accessible to all your employees. Give each employee a copy of the policy, post it in areas where your employees congregate, such as the lunchroom or a meeting room, and make it available online. Another step is to have all of your employees sign a copy of the policy indicating that they have read and understood it and will abide by it. Provide a signature line where employees can sign it. Every employee of your organization must be required to sign the policy and a copy retained by you. Be sure to translate or explain the policy to your employees who may not understand it because of their lack of fluency in English, their level of literacy, or other reasons. In addition, your employee needs to be educated on what constitutes harassment and how to use the policy. This includes informing them of their responsibility in creating a zero-tolerance environment that is respectful to everyone. It also includes training your managers and supervisors on how to deal with a complaint under the policy. A critical step is to make sure that your managers and supervisors take action immediately when there is harassment. The sooner they act, the more likely that the employee will not go outside your organization to resolve their complaint. Your organization has an obligation to keep to the process and timelines outlined in the policy. If for some reason the timelines cannot be met, communicate it to the person making the complaint and to the person against whom the complaint is being made. Effective implementation means updating the policy regularly. As you heard earlier, tribunal and court decisions may have an impact on the policy, and someone must be responsible for updating it and providing copies of the revised policy to all your employees. Finally, remind your employees regularly of the policy. Most employees forget about the policy within a short time of receiving it. In workshops, employees often tell me that the organization doesn't have a policy when in fact they do. They were probably given a copy of the policy when they first started with the company and have never looked at it since.
So now that Sushila has walked us through the process for developing and implementing a harassment prevention policy in the workplace, let's move on to an example that will help illustrate effective development and implementation of a policy. Here's the scenario. Beth began working for a large company. She alleged that her manager made inappropriate sexual comments and touched her inappropriately. She informed Human Resources and requested anonymity. When the harassment continued, she made a complaint under the Internal Harassment Prevention Policy. Shortly after, she went on a medical leave, and the note stated that she was under stress related to the work environment, specifically unresolved sexual harassment involving a manager. Think about this situation and take a moment to answer, what do you think the company should have done to ensure that Beth's allegations were dealt with effectively? Just take a minute to answer this for yourself, and then we will talk about it on the next slide. So what did you think this company should have done with this complaint? They should have taken the complaint seriously. They should have followed the process outlined in their company policy. They should have dealt with the complaint as soon as it was reported to Human Resources. Even though Beth had asked for it to be anonymous, the company had an obligation to take the steps to deal with it. And they should have ensured that the harassment stopped immediately. So for example, they should have separated the two employees if they were working together. That concludes the process for developing and implementing an effective harassment prevention policy in your workplace. If you have any further questions, you can feel free to email us at educationcommunityservices@gov.ab.ca, and we will get back to you. The Alberta Human Rights Commission has a number of resources to help you develop your own policies. Visit our website at albertahumanrights.ab.ca, where you will find the following resources. We have 4 information sheets related to this topic. We have developing and implementing an effective harassment and sexual harassment policy. We have harassment as a form of discrimination. There's sexual harassment. And the last information sheet is a sample harassment prevention policy that you can use to guide you in developing your own policy. We also have an information sheet entitled Protected Areas and Grounds under the Alberta Human Rights Act, which outlines the areas and grounds that are protected under the legislation. Another resource is a video scenario on sexual harassment available via our website that portrays Indira's story. Finally, if you have a specific situation or want to learn more about making a human rights complaint, the Commission has a confidential inquiry line that you can call to speak to a human rights officer.